Rain lashed against the frosted windows of Beaumont's tea room when 3 identical 8-year-old girls slid into Arthur's booth. Before he could blink, the girl in the middle grabbed his sleeve, her voice trembling. "Please," she whispered, eyes darting toward the imposing men at the door. "Pretend you're our father." Arthur Pendleton was a man who appreciated the quiet, predictable rhythms of a Saturday afternoon. At 34, a widowed architect struggling to keep his independent restoration firm afloat, his life was a relentless cycle of balancing spreadsheets, meeting unyielding contractors, and raising his 7-year-old son, Leo. But this weekend, Leo was away at a wilderness scout camp, leaving Arthur with a rare, almost unsettling 24 hours of absolute solitude. He had chosen to spend it in the secluded corner of Beaumont's, an upscale, discreet tea room in Boston's Back Bay, nursing a pot of Earl Grey and reviewing the blueprints of a crumbling Victorian brownstone he was desperately trying to save. He didn't notice the triplets until the scent of damp wool and panic interrupted the aroma of bergamot. They moved like synchronized shadows, slipping under the mahogany partition and crowding onto the velvet banquette opposite him. They were identical, sharp blue eyes, messy chestnut braids, and matching navy pea coats that, despite being soaked with rain, bore the unmistakable cut of high-end tailoring. Arthur lowered his reading glasses, his brow furrowing. "Can I help you, girls? Are you lost?" The one sitting closest to the aisle, clearly the ringleader, leaned forward. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Please," she repeated, her voice a fragile thread of terror. "Pretend you're our father. Just for 5 minutes. Do not look at the door." Arthur's paternal instincts, honed by years of single-handedly managing toddler meltdowns and playground scrapes, flared instantly. He didn't look at the door. Instead, he looked at the girls. The one by the window was silently crying, her tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks, while the middle one held her hand in a vice grip. "Okay," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register. "Take your coats off. Now, shove them under the table." The girls obeyed instantly, shedding the distinctive navy coats. "What are your names?" Arthur asked, picking up a spare china teacup and pouring a generous splash of warm milk into it. "I'm Clara," the leader whispered. "This is Chloe, and that's Cora." "All right, Clara, Chloe, Cora. I'm Arthur. Here is what we are going to do. You are going to share this plate of scones. You are going to argue with each other about who gets the clotted cream, and you are going to look incredibly bored." Arthur grabbed a napkin and casually wiped a smudge of dirt from Chloe's cheek. As he did, he subtly shifted his posture, angling his broad shoulders to completely obscure the girls from the main entryway. Out of the corner of his eye, reflected in the brass teapot, he saw them. 2 men. They didn't look like frantic fathers or store security. They wore immaculate charcoal suits, earpieces, and the cold, predatory expressions of men who solved problems for money. They were scanning the room, dissecting every table. "They're coming," Cora whimpered softly, shrinking against the velvet upholstery. "Let them come," Arthur said, breaking a scone in half and thrusting it into Clara's hand. "Eat. Complain about the raisins." The heavier of the 2 men stopped at the end of Arthur's booth. He didn't introduce himself. He just stared at the girls, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Are these your children?" Arthur didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, set the cup down, and then turned his head. He allowed a look of profound, exhausted irritation to wash over his face, the universal look of a father whose patience was entirely spent. "Yes, they are," Arthur said, his tone clipped and defensive. "And unless you are the manager coming to tell me why it took 20 minutes to get a plate of pastries, I suggest you step back. I am in the middle of a very difficult conversation about why we do not run away from our father in a crowded department store." The man hesitated, glancing at his partner near the door. "We're looking for 3 girls who got separated from their nanny." "Well, you haven't found them," Arthur snapped, leaning out of the booth aggressively. "These 3 are mine, and they are currently grounded until college. Now back off, or I'm calling the police to report a pair of creeps harassing my daughters." The mention of the police did the trick. Private security, especially the illicit kind, hated a paper trail. The man raised his hands in a placating gesture, muttered an apology, and backed away. A minute later, the brass bell above Beaumont's door chimed as the 2 men stepped back out into the pouring rain. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Clara slumped back against the booth, letting the scone drop to the plate. "Thank you," she gasped. Before Arthur could ask them exactly what kind of trouble they were in, the heavy oak doors of the tea room violently swung open again. This time it wasn't a thug. It was a woman. She looked as though she had stepped off the cover of a financial magazine and straight into a hurricane. Her platinum blonde hair was plastered to her cheekbones, and her sleek, charcoal trench coat was drenched. Her eyes, a piercing, icy grey, swept the room with a terrifying intensity. "Mom!" Chloe shrieked, scrambling out of the booth. The woman's icy demeanor shattered. She dropped to her knees, right there on the expensive hardwood floor, catching all 3 girls in a desperate, crushing embrace. Arthur watched as Genevieve Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Innovations, pioneer in green tech, and currently the most ruthlessly scrutinized woman in corporate America, wept openly into her daughter's damp hair. Suddenly, Genevieve looked up, her gaze locking onto Arthur. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating stare of a predator protecting its young. 2 massive bodyguards flooded into the room behind her, securing the exits. "Who are you?" Genevieve demanded, her voice like cracking ice as she stood up, pulling the girls behind her legs. "And what were you doing with my daughters?" "Mum, stop! He saved us!" Clara yelled, tugging on Genevieve's trench coat. "Richard's men were here, the scary ones with the earpieces. We ran from the nanny because she was talking to them on her phone. This man hid us." The name Richard caused a visible shudder to rip through Genevieve's frame. The hostility in her eyes dialed back, though the sheer intensity remained. She looked at Arthur, really looked at him, taking in his worn tweed jacket, the calluses on his hands from drafting and site work, and the absolute lack of intimidation in his posture. "Donovan," Genevieve snapped without looking back. One of the bodyguards, a towering man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "Ma'am, sweep the block. If Richard's ghosts are still out there, I want license plates and faces. Then get the armored car to the service alley. We are leaving." She turned back to Arthur, her tone leaving 0 room for negotiation. "You're coming with us?" "I most certainly am not," Arthur replied smoothly, gathering his blueprints and sliding them into his leather satchel. "I'm glad your girls are safe, Ms. Sterling, but my involvement ended the moment those thugs walked out the door. I have a business to run and a son to pick up tomorrow." "Please, Arthur," Cora whispered, stepping out from behind her mother's leg. It was the first time the quietest triplet had spoken directly to him. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his tweed jacket. "The bad men might come back for you." Genevieve watched the interaction, a strange calculation flashing in her eyes. "She's right," Genevieve said quietly. "If Richard's men saw your face, they will run it through facial recognition. By midnight, my ex-husband will know exactly who you are, where you live, and what vulnerabilities you have. If you want to protect your son, Mr. Pendleton, you will walk out the back door with us right now." 20 minutes later, Arthur found himself sitting in the cavernous living room of a penthouse overlooking the Boston Harbor. The space was a masterclass in minimalist wealth, floor-to-ceiling glass, stark white marble, and modern art that cost more than Arthur's entire architectural firm. The triplets had been whisked away by a hyper-efficient, heavily vetted head of household staff to be bathed and fed. Arthur sat on a low-slung Italian leather sofa, nursing a glass of scotch that Genevieve had poured for him. Genevieve sat opposite him, having traded her wet trench coat for a sleek silk blouse and tailored trousers. The armor was back on. "I owe you an apology and an explanation," Genevieve began, swirling her own glass. "My ex-husband, Richard Caldwell, is a corporate raider. 3 years ago, I divorced him because I caught him trying to sell off the proprietary, clean energy patents my father built to a foreign conglomerate. He's never forgiven me for publicly humiliating him." "And the girls?" Arthur asked, his voice steady. "Richard doesn't care about the girls. He cares about leverage," Genevieve said bitterly. "Tomorrow, the board of Sterling Innovations votes on a massive merger that will cement my control of the company. Richard has been orchestrating a smear campaign, painting me as an erratic, work-obsessed mother who neglects her children. His goal today was simple: have his private security rescue my daughters after they mysteriously wandered away from a corrupted nanny. He would then file an emergency ex parte motion for sole custody, claiming I am an unfit mother." Arthur frowned, the pieces clicking together. "If he gets emergency custody, you'd be tied up in court." "I'd be destroyed," Genevieve corrected. "The board would demand I step down as CEO to deal with the family crisis. Richard's proxy would step in, and he would dismantle my company piece by piece. You ruined his narrative today, Arthur. You kept them safe." "I just did what any decent person would do," Arthur said, setting his glass down. "But respectfully, Mrs. Sterling, this is a billionaire's war. I am a single father, trying to keep a 4-person architectural firm from declaring bankruptcy. I don't belong in this crossfire." "That is exactly why you are the perfect solution," Genevieve said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto his. Arthur blinked. "Solution to what?" "To my image problem. To Richard's entire legal strategy," Genevieve explained, the pace of her words quickening. "Richard's lawyers are going to argue that I provide an unstable, chaotic, and dangerous environment for Clara, Chloe, and Cora. They are going to point to my wealth, my bodyguards, my travel schedule. They will say the girls lack a grounded, traditional family structure." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I need a buffer, Arthur. I need a counter-narrative so airtight that a family court judge will laugh Richard out of the room. I need to show the world that my daughters have a perfectly stable, loving, ordinary father figure in their lives." Arthur stared at her, the absurdity of the conversation washing over him. "You want to hire me to be a glorified babysitter?" "No," Genevieve said softly, her voice carrying a sudden, heavy weight. "I want to hire you to be my fiancé." The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. "You're out of your mind," Arthur finally said, standing up. "I have a son, a real life. I am not pretending to be engaged to a CEO to manipulate a board vote and a custody battle." "Arthur, sit down," Genevieve commanded, though there was a hint of pleading beneath the steel. "I have already had my team run a background check on you while we were in the car. Your firm, Pendleton Restorations, is 3 weeks away from defaulting on a $500,000 commercial loan. Your late wife's medical bills decimated your savings. You are a talented architect, but you are drowning." Arthur felt his jaw clench. The raw invasion of privacy stung, but the undeniable truth of her words stung more. "Here is my proposition," Genevieve continued, sliding a thick, leather-bound folder across the glass coffee table. "You and your son, Leo, move into the east wing of my estate in Concord. It is heavily fortified. Richard will never get within a mile of you. You play the role of my devoted fiancé for 6 months. You attend public galas with me. You do school drop-offs. And you provide a completely stable, boring, wholesome presence for my daughters, who, by the way, already adore you." "And in return?" Arthur asked, despite his better judgment. "In return," Genevieve said, "I wipe out your firm's debt entirely. I will contract Pendleton Restorations to handle the redesign of Sterling Innovations' new corporate campus, a $50 million project that will put your name on the map and guarantee your son's financial future forever. And most importantly, I keep you and Leo safe from Richard." Arthur looked at the folder. Inside was the salvation of his life's work and the guarantee of Leo's future. But it required stepping into a fabricated lie with a woman whose world was a minefield of corporate espionage and ruthless enemies. He thought of the look of absolute terror in little Clara's eyes at the tea shop. He thought of his own son. 6 months, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low rumble as he reached for the folder. "And you do not interfere with how I raise my boy. If we do this, the girls and Leo get to be normal kids. No bodyguards hovering in the living room. No business calls during dinner." Genevieve exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for 3 years. A faint, genuine smile cracked her icy exterior. "Deal, Mr. Pendleton. Welcome to the family." The transition from a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville to the sprawling, 20-acre Sterling estate in Concord was nothing short of a seismic shock for 7-year-old Leo. When Arthur's battered Volvo station wagon pulled through the wrought-iron security gates, flanked by men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, Leo's eyes went wide. The estate was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, all red brick, towering white columns, and immaculate ivy. But to Arthur it felt like a beautifully gilded cage. "Dad," Leo whispered, his nose pressed against the glass. "Is this a hotel?" "Nobody," Arthur replied, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "This is where we're going to stay for a while. Remember the rules we talked about? Be polite, don't touch the fancy vases, and pretend we've known Genevieve forever," Leo recited perfectly. The moment they stepped into the grand foyer, the triplets descended the sweeping mahogany staircase like a tidal wave. Clara, Chloe, and Cora bypassed Arthur entirely and surrounded Leo. Within 5 minutes, they had dragged the bewildered boy off to the West Wing to show him the indoor heated pool and the private screening room. Genevieve watched them go from the landing, a cup of black coffee in her hand. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, looking less like a corporate titan and more like a deeply exhausted mother. "He's a good kid, Arthur," she said, descending the stairs. "Thank you for bringing him into this madness." "He's adaptable," Arthur said, setting down his duffel bag. "But I meant what I said about keeping their lives normal. I'm taking them all to school tomorrow in the Volvo. No armored SUVs, no motorcades. If we want the world to believe this is real, we do the morning drop-off like an actual family." Genevieve hesitated, the fear evident in her eyes. "Richard hired Black Cube. They are an elite private intelligence agency, Arthur. They aren't mall cops. If they see an opening—" "They won't," Arthur said firmly. "I spent my 20s running restoration crews on some of the roughest construction sites in Boston. I know how to spot a tail, and I know how to protect my own. Trust me." Over the next 2 months, the facade became a terrifyingly comfortable routine. Arthur drove the 4 children to their elite private academy every morning, his presence a stark contrast to the fleet of chauffeured Maybachs and Bentleys in the drop-off line. He stood on the sidelines of soccer games, cheering alongside a rigidly tense Genevieve, secretly slipping her thermoses of chamomile tea to replace her anxiety-fueled espresso. To the public, the narrative was flawless. The Boston Globe ran a glowing Sunday feature on Genevieve's grounding romance with the handsome, widowed architect. Paparazzi caught photos of Arthur hoisting a laughing Cora onto his shoulders at a farmer's market, with Genevieve smiling warmly beside them. The Sterling Innovation stock price stabilized, and the board members pushing for Richard's hostile takeover began to lose their leverage. But behind the closed doors of the Concord estate, the lines between performance and reality were rapidly blurring. Late at night, after the children were asleep, Arthur and Genevieve would sit in the estate's massive library. What started as strategy meetings to review Richard's legal maneuvers evolved into genuine, vulnerable conversations. Arthur learned about the crushing pressure of inheriting a global tech empire at 25, and Genevieve learned about the suffocating grief Arthur felt when his wife passed away, leaving him to raise Leo alone. One Tuesday evening, rain lashing against the library windows, a haunting echo of the day they met at Beaumont's tea room, Genevieve broke down. Richard filed another motion, she whispered, staring into the fireplace. Her voice was hollow. He found out about your firm's financial troubles before I paid off your debts. He's going to argue in family court that I bought you, that you're a hired actor, and that I'm exposing the girls to a manipulative grifter. Arthur set his drafting pencil down. He walked over to the leather armchair where Genevieve was curled up, looking incredibly small. He knelt beside her, taking her cold, trembling hands in his calloused ones. "Genevieve, look at me," he commanded softly. She lifted her icy grey eyes. He can argue whatever he wants, but he cannot fake the fact that Clara finally stopped having night terrors. He cannot fake the fact that Chloe painted a family portrait yesterday, and she included Leo and me. Let him bring his lawyers. I am not going anywhere. For a fleeting second, the armor completely dissolved. Genevieve leaned forward, her forehead resting against his shoulder. Arthur instinctively wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her expensive citrus perfume and the very real, very human exhaustion beneath it. It was no longer a business arrangement. He was falling for her. The moment was shattered by the buzzing of Arthur's phone. It was an unknown number. Arthur answered it, putting it on speaker. "Mr. Pendleton," a slick, venomous voice purred through the speaker. "Richard Caldwell here. I hope you're enjoying the accommodations at my ex-wife's house. I just thought you should know the brakes on 1998 Volvo station wagons are notoriously unreliable, especially when driving 4 children down steep, rainy hills. Have a good night." The line went dead. Genevieve let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Arthur's blood ran completely cold. The corporate game had just ended. This was a direct threat to the children. The Sterling Innovation's annual charity gala was held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was the social event of the season, a glittering ocean of diamonds, bespoke tuxedos, and ruthless networking. For Genevieve, it was the final battleground. Tomorrow morning was the emergency custody hearing, followed immediately by the shareholder vote on the merger. She wore a breathtaking emerald green gown that seemed to capture the ambient light of the museum's rotunda, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. Arthur stood by her side in a sharply tailored black tuxedo, his hand resting securely on the small of her back. They looked like royalty. But beneath the surface, the tension was suffocating. Arthur had spent the last 48 hours acting not as an architect, but as a deeply paranoid father. He had grounded the Volvo, utilizing Genevieve's armored convoy for the children, and had called in a favor from his brother, a former military police officer, to quietly monitor the estate's perimeter alongside Genevieve's security team. Halfway through the evening, as a string quartet played softly in the background, the crowd parted. Richard Caldwell approached. He was a handsome man in a predatory way, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Two of his black cube security men trailed a few paces behind him. "Genevieve, darling," Richard sneered, offering a mock toast with his champagne flute. "You look incredibly stressed. Are the pressures of motherhood and corporate leadership finally cracking that perfect porcelain face?" "Hello, Richard," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a freezing sub-zero temperature. "I see you're still crashing parties you weren't invited to." Richard chuckled, turning his dead eyes toward Arthur. "And this must be the hired help. Tell me, Arthur, how much does it cost to buy a man's dignity these days? Is it enough to cover the pathetic ruins of your little construction business?" Arthur didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his sparkling water. "It costs exactly nothing to protect people from a coward, Richard." Richard's smile vanished. He stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space. "You think you're clever? You think you can play in this league? Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Judge Harper is going to grant me full emergency custody of my daughters, and immediately after, your little girlfriend's board is going to strip her of her company because of the scandal. You are a speed bump, Pendleton." "Judge Harper," Arthur repeated thoughtfully, swirling the ice in his glass. "That's an interesting name. I was actually just reviewing some blueprints this morning, specifically the blueprints for a luxury ski chalet in Aspen." Richard froze. The arrogant posture rigidified. "What are you talking about?" Arthur stepped forward, his broad shoulders easily eclipsing Richard's frame. He lowered his voice so only the three of them could hear. "When you threatened my son's life on Tuesday, Richard, you made a severe miscalculation," Arthur said, his tone lethally calm. "You assumed I was just a blue-collar idiot. But architects are meticulous. We look at foundations. We look at structural integrity. And we follow paper trails. I noticed your shell company, Caldwell Holdings, recently commissioned a $3 million chalet in Aspen. The title, however, was quietly transferred to a trust owned by the wife of the Honorable Judge Harper." Genevieve inhaled sharply, looking at Arthur in shock. She hadn't known he was digging into this. "You're bluffing," Richard hissed, though a bead of sweat materialized on his temple. "Am I?" Arthur reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek, black USB drive. "I spent the last 2 days pulling public construction permits, shell company registries, and offshore wire transfers. It's all right here. Bribing a family court judge is a federal offense, Richard. Threatening a child across state lines over a telecommunications network is another." Arthur pressed the USB drive hard into Richard's chest. "Here is what is going to happen," Arthur commanded. "You are going to withdraw your custody petition tonight. You are going to resign your proxy votes from the Sterling board by midnight, and you are going to get on your private jet and disappear to Europe. Because if you ever look at Genevieve, the triplets, or my son again, I will personally walk this drive into the FBI field office." Richard stared at the small black drive as if it were a live grenade. He looked up at Arthur, realizing with crushing certainty that he had been outmaneuvered not by a billionaire CEO, but by a desperate, fiercely protective father. Without a word, Richard snatched the drive, turned on his heel, and walked out of the museum, his security detail scrambling to keep up. Genevieve stood frozen, her chest heaving. She looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound relief. "How did you—" she started, her voice shaking. "I told you," Arthur said softly, reaching out to gently tuck a stray blonde curl behind her ear. "I protect my own." The next morning, the news hit the financial networks like a thunderclap. Richard Caldwell had unexpectedly withdrawn his custody suit and liquidated his remaining interests in Sterling Innovations, citing a sudden move to Switzerland for health reasons. By noon, the board unanimously approved Genevieve's merger. Her empire was secure. That evening, the Concord estate was terrifyingly quiet. The contract was technically over. The threat was gone. Arthur stood in the grand foyer, his duffel bag packed, waiting for Leo to say goodbye to the girls. He felt a hollow ache in his chest that rivaled the grief he had felt years ago. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had made his own role obsolete. Footsteps clicked against the marble behind him. "You're leaving," Genevieve said. She wasn't wearing her CEO armor. She was wearing one of Arthur's old, oversized flannel shirts, her feet bare against the cold floor. "The job is done, Genevieve," Arthur said, forcing a sad smile. "Richard is gone. Your company is safe. You have your daughters." "I have my daughters," Genevieve repeated, walking slowly toward him. "But Clara asked me at dinner why her dad was packing his bags. Chloe is crying in the pool house, and Cora is currently trying to barricade Leo in his bedroom so he can't leave." Arthur swallowed hard. "They'll adjust. Kids are resilient." "I'm not," Genevieve whispered. She stopped inches from him, looking up into his eyes. The icy grey was entirely melted, replaced by a fierce, undeniable warmth. "The contract was for 6 months of pretending, Arthur. But I haven't been pretending for a long time. Please don't take my family away." Arthur let out a breath that felt like a surrender. He dropped his duffel bag onto the marble floor. He reached out, pulling Genevieve into a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of salt, tears, and the unmistakable promise of a real, chaotic, beautiful future. Upstairs, peeking through the mahogany banister, 4 children silently high-fived. Arthur and Genevieve built a life that perfectly bridged their 2 worlds. Pendleton Restorations flourished, designing sustainable campuses that revolutionized the city's skyline, while Genevieve led her tech empire with renewed, grounded strength. The Concord estate ceased to be a quiet fortress and became a loud, messy home. They proved that true family isn't about blood or contracts, but the fierce, unconditional choice to protect and love one another.